Buenas tardes a todos. Qué placer estar.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be again with you in the middle of the day in the third ACTEC Congress in the framework of the 28th Aapresid Conference with a very special guest. It's a pleasure to it's a pleasure and an honor to receive for the first time John de la Parra. I had the opportunity to meet him last year when I traveled to Boston. And in the presentation that he made in Indigo, the biologic product company. And we thought with Martin that it was a good idea to invite him to come, and he was um, kind enough to accept the invitation. Dr. John de la Parra is an botanic with a specialty in medicinal plants. He currently is the manager of the global food portfolio in the Rockefeller Foundation. He works on the implementation of a fair and sustainable food system. He developed the periodic food table, which is highly interesting. You are welcome to go and visit www.foodperiodictable.org to look at this table. As a professor in the Harvard University, he had delivered lectures and short courses, and she has had positions in the MIT, and he has been a professor in the Tufts University and a biotechnology professor in other universities. He was raised in a farm in Alabama, and part of his family, his father come from Mexico, and his mother, sorry, comes from Surami, and his grandmother was responsible for him becoming an ethnobotanic. Thank you very much, John, for being here. It will be a pleasure for us to listen to your presentation, and then we will be able to ask some questions in a Q&A session. You can take the floor. Thank you. Buenos días.
I am a researcher at Harvard University and also the manager of the global food portfolio at the Rockefeller Foundation. I want to thank everyone for joining me today, and also the organizers of the Aapresid Virtual Conference 2020. I'm so happy to be here and be a part of this. I'm sorry that we cannot all be together. I hope one day in the future we'll be able to. I'm going to share my screen now and get our talk started. So what I'll be talking about is the process of developing more nourishing and sustainable food systems that runs a breadth from indigenous knowledge to big data. And this really encompasses the work that I've done personally as a researcher and the work that I also promote through the work that I do at the Rockefeller Foundation. So I'll talk a little bit about myself, as uncomfortable as that might be. I'll just let you know a little bit about me. So I grew up on a farm in Alabama, which is in the southern part of the United States. We grew the food that we ate. My parents still live there and grow the food that we eat. We also raised goats, and that's where I really got my start in the wonder of agriculture and the resiliency of the family unit as it relies on plants as both food and medicine. I left the farm and I was trained in plant biotechnology, plant chemistry, and particularly in ethnobotany, where I developed an expertise in understanding how indigenous people in particular develop their own technologies in order to cope with the world and the changing world. And then started thinking more about how the globalized technologies that we all use integrate, can prop up and support, and also learn from those indigenous technologies. My research areas have been in genetic engineering, controlled environment, agriculture, and plant phenotyping in particular. And the end result of that is often a measurement of plant chemistry, which I'll talk a little bit more about in my talk. And I've taught many courses at a few institutions, mostly in the Boston area where I currently live, at Tufts University, Northeastern University, and also at Harvard. I have taught classes in agricultural biotechnology, the future of farming, on medicinal plants and even psychoactive plants, and also on the field work of actually understanding how we collect the data out in the field. As I mentioned, some of my work has interfaced between indigenous knowledge and advanced globalized technologies that many of us incorporate into our lives in many ways, even if we're just consumers of the end products. One of these culminated in a work called Ethnophytotechnology that I wrote with Professor Cassandra Quave at Emory University, who is also an ethnobotanist, that sought to integrate the utilization of ethnobotanical knowledge with the utilization of biotechnological tools. So in this figure here, which is from publication, we really talked about medicinal plants in particular, but this could be applied to all types of agriculture that starts with an indigenous understanding of how plant material is chosen, and then how we subsequently can integrate that knowledge to learn more and improve our globalized technological systems, especially when it comes to agriculture and plant technologies. I mentioned that I'm a researcher at Harvard University. Most of my time is spent at the herbarium, which is a collection of dried and pressed plant samples. And those plant samples in my work are used to catalog chemical diversity. So indigenous people often, in some cases, engaged in helping to collect these plant samples at certain times. And we know that plants are not just harvest based on the species, and I will return to this note again in the talk, but not just based on their species, but also where, when, how they were harvested. All those things affect the chemistry of the plant. And some of the work that I've been engaged in at Harvard is to look at how the chemical diversity of those plants is reflected in the indigenous knowledge so that better plants can be chosen and phenotypic expression can be acknowledged with regard to hard-won knowledge of people on the ground. A few months ago, I took a position at the Rockefeller Foundation as a manager of the global food portfolio. The Rockefeller Foundation has a long history of supporting agricultural endeavors, including this person here is Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, I believe in 1970, as part of a recognition of the efforts of the Green Revolution, which helped feed a planet that at the time was starting to come to a point where we would not be able to feed the people on the planet. There are consequences of that Green Revolution, which have led to a proliferation of industrialized agricultural innovations that then have led to consequences such as a reduction in the amount in water accessibility because crops take a lot of water to grow, the use of industrialized different methods that have maybe impacted the world in not the best way. And part of the work of Rockefeller now is to now look at the quality of the food, not just the quantity of that food. And I'm working on a lot of those projects as we speak. I've collaborated on many different projects that also have to do with this. So, and I'll touch on this later in the talk, but controlled environment optimization. So how can we use controlled environments to optimize production of plant traits? I've done a lot of ethnobotanical fieldwork, so actually understanding how and why indigenous people might select particular plants for particular reasons. I've worked in engineering plant metabolic pathways to produce more of particular plant compounds, for instance, medicinal plant compounds, and also just doing the novel plant metabolite analysis. So at the end stage, what do those metabolites look like? But all this work that I've been focused on during my life and my research the fundamental question of this is, why do we need this innovation? What really drives this? And we have heard a lot about global climate change. We know that there are longer periods of drought and flooding. This figure here shows the deviation in temperature average from 1901 just to 2000, and we see a clear upward trend here. So more severe weather, and also relocation of farms to areas with more water because the rainfall is not assured. We also see a growing population. We expect there to be at least 10 billion people by the end of this century. That number has been reported in a few places that perhaps it will come back down after a crest in the middle part of this century. But at some point, we will probably have 10 billion people on the planet that need to be fed. And it's expected that up to 93% of that increase will be in Africa and Asia in particular. You can see in this figure how it is expected that that population increase will be distributed. And at the same time, we see increasing disparities in arable land. We also see a reduction in farmable land. So that leads to crowding. So we need to grow food in more places and we have less place to grow it, so there'll be crowding. We see countries purchasing offshore farms, countries like China purchasing land in other countries in order to support their own population. And we see that open grazing lands are often reduced for human food production. So it may be that cattle production has to be reduced so that we can produce more human food. And one thing that kind of links all these things together is an increasing distrust in agriculture by the world's population. We, as part of this, and part of this is fueled by populist leaders and other influences around the world, but we see a generation and a proliferation of misinformation, which can add to a fear of innovation generally, which then can result in uninformed legislation. So this butts up against some common consumer expectations. So what do consumers want? They want quality, nutrition. All people want this, right? Quality, nutritious food, humane treatment of animals, safety, a food production that's sensitive to climate change, whether it's officially acknowledged or not. This is something that we'll have to pay attention to. And of course, a sufficient quantity. So this encompasses a type of quality and a type of quantity check on our food system. So some common consumer perceptions, though, are that there are real safety concerns over many things in our food systems, including imported foods, pesticides, genetically modified organisms. We hear a lot about these things, and there are valid concerns about some of these. And at the same time, most consumers are very perceptive to a rising cost for high quality, healthy food. And how is that balanced to feed their families? The price and the quality of food has to be balanced. So in general, many consumers just have a feeling that the food system is on the wrong track, but why is that? Well, I think that there are some things that are missing that could really help this whole situation, and they may be fairly simple and straightforward, but we need more facts and data, and then we need, I think, a very perceptive and clear translation of those facts and data in ways that consumers can understand. But in general, the average consumer doesn't have enough information to hold an informed opinion. So how do we translate? So that critical translation point, how do we translate that critical knowledge into something that consumers can use? So first, I think we need to acknowledge the consumer's concerns, several of the things that I already mentioned. Communicate common values, so things that maybe a business values and also the consumer values, as some of those things I already mentioned. And then highlight innovations that meet those values. Some really great examples are in the genetically modified organism category, which can be very controversial, but there are actually great examples of how consumer expectation, perception, and values can all meet together to solve common issues. For instance, rice, in things developed like golden rice, we see an initiative to prevent malnutrition around the world. So if humans care about quality food to feed a lot of people around the world, genetically modified rice actually meets a consumer expectation and a value there. Wouldn't it be great if we had peanuts that would not have aflatoxin, so we could stop deadly allergies, right? So perhaps and other issues with allergies in general, could we understand how we use technology to combat those? And developing staple crops like wheat that can survive drought. All these things meet consumer values. And then on the agricultural side, we need to understand the greater vision that agriculture is uniquely human, and that trust, as I mentioned in a previous slide, that trust is really what's missing here, can be built by acknowledging those human roots, and that agriculture is a holistic, interconnected practice. What that means in the technological side and the globalized technology of agricultural and food systems is that we need to think about revolutionary collaborations. And Cornell University has identified 8 disciplines of focus as just an example of how this could be done, from data science, digital agriculture, genome biology, humanities and arts, which may be surprising, but is very important, infection biology, nanoscale science and molecular engineering, social sciences and sustainability. Some of these topics may not be what most would expect would be in the type of technological advances that we need to think about, but we find that things like social science and humanities and arts actually help to transfer trust to people around the world, so that we aren't just developing these technologies in a box. And all of this really speaks to an ancient, in many ways, holistic, integrated practice of agriculture, which will help us develop future innovations in, for instance, crop quality. So not just crop quantity, but also the quality of those crops. So let's talk about how revolutionary collaboration has played out in these holistic environments. So we've had about 10,000 years of human intelligence in agriculture. We may think actually much longer than that, but scholars generally agree that agriculture, as we think of it, was developed around 10 to 12,000 years ago, and then sporadically throughout those thousands of years. So you see this image here, which I've taken from an Insider article, and I have a couple images from this really interesting and excellent article. And I want you to think for a minute if you recognize what this is. And then as you formulate your guess of what this might be, we'll go to the next slide. And you'll see that actually is a precursor of maize, or corn. The corn that we eat, the corn that we feed to animals. That previous image, this is from teosinte, which you can see the plant on the right, had these small, hard to access kernels, and through thousands of years of human intervention and selective breeding, we've developed the corn, the maize that we eat now. This one may be a little bit harder, so take a second to think about what this image is a predecessor of. So that's actually a carrot before human intervention. So this was before humans got a hold of this plant and wanted to develop a more tasty and edible and perhaps nutritious plant. I showed these 2 slides actually to a group in the Netherlands a few months ago, and had them think about this as well. And there's an interesting possible explanation for the orange carrot, which is Willem van Oranje, which is William of Orange. Is a highly regarded historical figure in the Netherlands, and in order to honor him, merchants developed an orange carrot, and perhaps the orange carrot was developed before then, but they certainly popularized it by selling orange carrots during, I believe, his anniversary of his birth or his death. And then humans started to eat more and more orange carrots. Of course, there's other colored carrots, there's white carrots and purple carrots, and there's even a development of a more red carrot. So humans have the ability to, through these integrated practices, to develop really interesting food items that we use today. And here's a few more examples from that same article. I mentioned on the left is before human intervention and breeding, And on the right is after, and we see banana full of seeds and maybe not very tasty. Watermelon has a very interesting story. It's in a family, the same family that's in the cucumber and in other even bitter type melons that, and these fruits were not necessarily as desirable as we see them today, which are very sweet and tasty. And then eggplant on the bottom also went through its own evolution. And perhaps some of you are familiar with Brassica oleracea, which is the core species, but then we have cultivated varieties of many different plants that are actually all the same species, but just through human intervention, through selective breeding, we see cauliflower, kale, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, broccoli, and there are others as well that are all the same species, but just through selective breeding, we have these plants. In consumer perception, though, often we see new varieties, maybe cultivated varieties of plants, and many consumers might think that they're genetically modified. And really, this is where we have to think of what is the line between genetic modification and selective breeding as it is perceived by the average consumer. There is a technical definition, of course, that genetically modified organism is going to have some foreign DNA inserted in a laboratory setting. But humans have been doing some sort of modification of their food crops for a long time. So in the US at least, actual GMO crops, so DNA altered in the lab, really only encompasses 10 or 11 crops that are currently on the market. There are a few others that have been approved, but they don't have a market share to speak of. They haven't been popularized on the market. And as you can see, many of these are actually not, some of these are animal crops. So for instance, alfalfa, so animals may be eating genetically modified crops. And many of these are staple crops that are processed. So for instance, corn, rapeseed, which would be canola oil, soy perhaps would be. So when you walk into your average grocery store in the United States, at least, the vast majority of what you're looking at will not be genetically modified in terms of having foreign genetics inserted into the plant for breeding. Although some key important ones are things like papaya, which would have been wiped out in Hawaii, for instance, if it weren't for genetic modification that allowed us to save it from, to make a disease-resistant variety. And then selective breeding, which is a form of hybridization, are seedless fruits like seedless grapes, bananas, as I mentioned in all the pictures that I showed you, grapefruit, pluohat, tangelo. There are so many that consumers often have a mistrust of or think that this might be genetically modified in a laboratory sense, but are actually made through selective breeding. So essentially, this is just to highlight that there are tens of thousands of years of this collaborative work of human intelligence in agriculture, as opposed to, and the other part of my talk really is about 10 years, or it's approximate, but for a fact of big data and artificial intelligence of agriculture, which is its own form of revolutionary collaboration, which we hope will be able to lead to similar revolutionary concepts such as the banana, right, or maize, or the carrot, right? So in the same shocking way that those things have such a difference over tens of thousands or 10,000 years of selective breeding, artificial intelligence, if done properly, might be able to bring similar revolution. So we know we have access to things like satellite imagery, drone imagery, crop and soil innovations are using artificial intelligence, such as the work through Indigo Ag and others, sensors, the Internet of Things, IoT, and precision ag, robotics. All these technologies are revolutionary, they must be collaborative, and can lead to great changes. And as we pursue these radical collaborations, which have been accelerated, right? We don't have 10,000 years to fix some of the problems that I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, like climate change. We only have a few summers left, right? We only have maybe 30 growing seasons before 2050 when we're creeping to 10 billion people on the planet. And that means we don't have many growing seasons to develop a new carrot or maize or those things that might change the course of human history. But as we pursue these things in artificial intelligence and big data, we have to be very vigilant for the inherent biases that exist in big data and listen to consumers so that we meet the trust that is necessary in order to incorporate these types of technologies. And some quotes that we hear are that big data will only serve that data, right? And this is an important concept, that data by itself can be manipulated in many different ways, and we need to make sure that we're looking at it with an eye that is keen for bias that exists in that data. We also can't ignore the farmer, the individual who's actually growing these things, and we can't ignore the knowledge of indigenous agricultural systems, which have existed for a long time and we hope continue to exist. So indigenous agricultural systems also value consistency and quality and safety, just like we've seen that consumers demand. And I'm going to talk a bit more now about the ethnobotanical work that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, and how this indigenous knowledge can be used, how it's very important, and how there's a lot that we can learn in technology and globalized agricultural technology from indigenous usage of plants in particular as food. And medicine. So food is, I often say, is the original medicine. In order to practice medicine, you had to be a botanist in some way. So plants, food, medicine, these things are on a continuum. Some things can be used for acute illnesses, but many foods support good health if chosen properly. But what we know is that about 80% of the world's population relies on crude plant preparations for the majority of their medical needs. So they're actually using these plants to treat themselves. So it's something that is very important to most health systems. And you can, when we say medicine, we can think of foods broadly that may be used, as I said, for acute illness or to support good health. So but the problem with ethnobotanical treatments can be, if a healer chooses a plant as, let's say, either a food or a medicine, how can we guarantee that we have the same quality the next day and the next day? So we have inherent variability when we pick a leaf out of the forest and we expect it to be the same every time. So that's part of the challenges faced by ethnobotanical treatments, but also ethnobotanical choices in food. So reproducibility of the product, widely varying metabolite production, so that could result in different flavors, different effects. And then we have many compounds within that plant that may have multiple quasi or actual pharmacological effect in the body. So, and why do plants do this? It's worth noting that plants can't run away or relocate to a more favorable location, so they produce very interesting chemistries. They produce things that we humans value for, as I mentioned, medicinal properties, but also flavors and scents and other things. And that's part of an inducible defense system. So they have an active defense system, which might be thorns or a thickened cuticle or other things like that. But these inducible defense systems are often involving the type of chemical warfare, you might think of it, to fight off pathogens, weather, other plants, herbivores. And this really is what infers the inherent ecological niche of the plant. This is Mama Margarita. This is from the Amazon Conservation Team website. She's a Comensal medicine woman from the Colombian Andes, who is purported to walk up and down a mountain every day for 6 hours looking for particular plants. And it isn't only that she's looking for a particular species of plant, but also in subtle environmental cues that will tell her what type of plant. So whether it's growing in one place or another, or is growing in a certain state or another, whether perhaps there are insects present or not. All those things will change the chemistry of a plant, which can then change the actual or quasi-pharmacological effects of either a food or a medicine plant. So these types of perceptions were developed over thousands of years, more than the 10,000 years of agriculture. But the ability to understand how to choose and when to choose and where to choose plants directly relates to the chemistry of that plant, which are valuable things within our agricultural system. So what are some applications of that? And this is where some of my actual research comes into play. So one project I worked on is to optimize the periwinkle. So this is the Madagascar periwinkle. this plant has been used for thousands of years for all types of medicinal uses, from diabetes to malaria. But it was found about 50 or 60 years ago that it also produces very potent chemicals that can be used for the treatment of cancer. It produces them in very low quantities. They're alkaloids in the leaves, and they're very valuable. They're considered essential drugs by the World Health Organization. So it's a big challenge to have to grow this plant. That the compounds are too complicated to produce in meaningful quantity in a laboratory, so they must be grown in the plant. So one project I worked on was to actually grow genetically modified roots of the plant that may produce more of these compounds. And a lot of this was focused on changing the genetics of the plant so that it produced more of particular, let's say, enzymes or transcription factors that would then cause the plant to make more of these compounds, so we could just make them in a bioreactor. And there are ways to grow these roots in large bioreactors, so we don't have to grow the plant in large fields in Africa and India where they're currently grown in order to collect and extract these chemical compounds, but we can actually do it in a bioreactor. It turns out that all that genetic engineering didn't really do a lot to the plant, but as a botanist, I started to think about how can we make this plant make more of these compounds by really speaking to our indigenous people and how they understand why a plant might make more of particular compounds. Even if it's not understood or described as compounds, these chemical compounds in the plant are reflected in the usage of the plant. So what I did in these experiments was I actually added a hormone to the plant tissue that caused the plant to react as if it were being attacked by an insect. And you can see in A, here in the box labeled A, plus methyl jasmonate, P3 and P6, the two peaks, were two new peaks that appeared only when the plant was treated with a hormone that made the plant act as if it were being eaten by an insect. And what that resulted in is, you can see on the right-hand side, these two new elicited compounds, which have then subsequently been tested by bioassays for various diseases and shown some promising potential usages. And that all happened because we started to look at how a plant changes within its environment. So why does the plant change its chemistry at all? So this was really a first clue. And then I started working on basil. Basil produces several compounds that have been described mechanistically to affect diabetes and the control of blood sugar. So a particular compound called eugenol. So what you see here are many different types of cultivars, essentially, of basil. And we found that by looking at all these different variations of basil leaves, there actually was one type that was producing more of this potential kind of anti-diabetic compound than all the others, and then subjected that plant to multiple different hormone treatments that simulated attack on the plant. So methyl salicylate can be associated with fungal infections in the plant. And what we saw is a 2.5-fold increase in eugenol. I mentioned methyl jasmonate. That's what I used on the Madagascar periwinkle to simulate an herbivory attack, so an insect chewing on the leaf. That resulted in a 13-fold increase in this compound. But then I added chitosan, which is essentially a ground up insect shells, a form of that, and got a 30-fold increase in eugenol. So what this would parallel to is an indigenous person perhaps understanding that when insects are present on a plant, it changes the chemistry of the plant to make it a more valuable product, or the opposite, right? It could be either way. In this case, when we simulated an insect attack by adding chitosan, we saw a 30-fold increase in this potential anti-diabetic compound. So you can see here on the top is the untreated peak with the red arrow, and on the bottom is after the treatment. We see this huge uptick in production of a particular compound. And all this related in some way to the way that indigenous communities might understand how quality, plant quality, food quality might change with environment. So how can we apply these ideas? So those were some experiments that maybe showed how these things might work, but how do we apply them? What are other ways? So some ways are through optimized flavors. So eugenol is actually a flavoring compound as well. So if you want to make a bunch of a certain type of flavor of something, you might listen and understand how indigenous people are selecting things and then maybe replicate that in a more controlled environment, see what happened. Optimize nutrition, so the idea of a nutraceutical or some particular compound that is in a plant that has nutritional value. And you can also do the reverse, where you optimize a plant for a change in climate conditions, so a more arid condition and things like that. And then how do we apply these to agriculture? The broad categories can be to predict optimum climates for growing. So how can we use these controlled environments and these experiments? We can actually use them to understand what climates might be ideal. So if it's a place that has a lot of drought, perhaps we found that the chemistry changes in a plant to be better or worse depending on the drought. And we can also manufacture particular agricultural products by putting them in controlled environments and growing them exactly how we want under very specific conditions. So controlling the environment, so through hydroponic systems or greenhouse conditions, we can control the environment and then start to replicate ideal situations. Then we measure accurately. So as you saw on the previous slide, this all relied on mass spectrometry to understand exactly all the diverse chemistry and how it changes. In this figure here, I took a couple of different types of basil that were grown in different ways. And we see that each different peak on here represents a different flavoring constituent, and they all change based on where the plant was grown, essentially. That work was published as a paper called Flavor Cyber Agriculture, which you can look up, where we optimize the production of plant metabolites in a controlled environment by using big data and artificial intelligence. And some press was made over this because of how, the potential impact of this type of work. So after having these controlled environments and doing measurements, you then want to optimize. So this was kind of the model for how we started to do this. So designing initial growth recipes, growing plants to maturity, measure the volatile compounds, in this case it was basil. And then on the big data side, we extract what is the target metric. So maybe it's optimization for a particular compound. We build surrogate models, and then we discover where the optimized parameters are. In line with this, a project I'm working on now at the Rockefeller Foundation, I encourage you to go to www.foodperiodictable.org. We are putting together a periodic table of food initiative, which seeks to create standardized methods and kits to measure the dark matter of food. We currently measure about 150 compounds in our food, but we know that there could be up to 30,000 different metabolites or compounds that are in our foods that are not being tracked. So this seeks to build this huge comprehensive database, a standardized way to measure all those different fluctuations that happen with environment and other things, storage conditions and things like that. Will all be a part of this. And this is a 3-year project to really get it off the ground. And if there's something you're interested in, please reach out to me or go to foodperiodictable.org. As we're having multiple sessions now, including in early September, we'll have a session if this is something you're interested in. Part of that data will feed into something that's been called the Foodome. This is from a paper by Laszlo Barabasi's group, where these tens of thousands of compounds can start to be linked to particular disease characteristics, and then we can find out, well, what is important in our food. So this all leads to envisioning a revolutionary path forward, where we can use existing digital assets from global weather data, global crop data, satellite image, global soil and land data, as I mentioned in previous slides, and then having goals of optimization, which include not just profit and quality and quantity, but sustainability, nutrition, and equity. And if we guide these principles with well-developed standards, so I mentioned standardization can be very important for cross-compatibility of data, accurate data, open availability and development of digital agricultural networks, we can start to build a revolutionary cycle for collaboration that starts with forming global networks that can agree on technical standards, develop data collection tools, implement these big data and AI techniques, disseminate open access information, and just keep iterating on that. So this revolutionary agricultural collaboration will depend on all players being present, from business to academia to government, consumers and nonprofits, and especially voices that maybe aren't traditionally held in this, like indigenous voices, where we know that they're valuable information and also that need to be part of the conversation as we move forward. So I want to thank you all for your time listening to my talk. I appreciate you listening, and I will be present for questions after this recording. Thank you so much. Look.
Outstanding, John. Thank you very much. The first time I learned about ethnobotanics was from you, and I'm still surprised with this story. I don't think that William of Orange is known all around the world, but nobody knows that he's the reason for the existence of that orange carrot. Very interesting. We have been receiving some questions. My phone is exploding. They are sending the questions directly to me. You talked about different aspects from different points of view. The lack of trust of consumers, this is increasing, and probably over-information does not collaborate with this, or misinformation. How do you think that these issues will be solved? This issue of trust. Do you think that certification models as we used to know them are over, and now we are going into a new era of recovering trust?
Great, thank you, Julian, so much. And thank you for the questions. As they come in, I'll be happy to answer anything that comes through. In terms of trust, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is that in the current state of the world, we have more access than we ever had as consumers, or consumers have more access than they have ever had to knowledge itself. But that also means that there's a lot of disinformation out there. So there's a lot of information that is not good, and it can be seized upon by opportunistic actors within the food system. That might mean politicians, it might mean business people that have other goals, and then put that out on the internet, which is a big source for how people get any information about their food system. So, you know, being a scientist, the first thing I think that we need is good data. So generating good data is number one, but then translation. So I talked a little bit about that translation. So even, you know, many consumers may mistrust science itself because we have gotten so many conflicting opinions from different people, maybe not scientists themselves, but we hear from politicians and businesses and other actors. But part of this integrative picture that I talked about, as Cornell has expressed to these 8 different disciplines that all feed into what the future of agriculture will be, we need people on our teams that are really good at that translation aspect. So you start with good data, and then you understand how to translate it into ways that consumers will be able to understand, and it will ensure trust. And some of the examples I gave were in particular around GMOs, because there's a lot of distrust around genetically modified organisms, maybe rightly so, because there have been a lot of business practices in particular that have been maybe not the best, and that has built on the distrust that then is easily the science is then easily exploited to be also in line with that type of nefarious acting. So if our businesses are hiring people that are really good at the translation of science, so that the average person can understand what this is and how it might benefit their life. So there's a great story about the papaya in Hawaii, right? So the papaya was, the Hawaiian papaya industry was going to go extinct. This wasn't going to happen because of, I believe it was a blight. And because we were able to have genetically modified papayas, the industry was saved, and now humans are eating genetically modified papayas, whether they know it or not. But that's a great economic story, right? It means that we save this industry. And then there are other stories, you know, golden rice could be one story, which itself has its own public relations issues. You know, it's a bigger story than I want to tell right here. But golden rice essentially is rice that has been genetically modified to be able to have carotenoids, beta carotene rather, in the rice itself, so that people don't have this deficiency anymore. And those are success stories that feed into the positive sides of these technologies. And I think that is one way to build trust back. It's not easy though. It's not easy, especially when you have I think that we see a rise of politicians in particular that play into populism, and it's easy to kind of generate a gut reaction for people rather than looking at the science and having this translation happen where we actually understand what is really happening. So I think it's kind of that system, from good data, having trustworthy organizations that are generating good data, to having the actual people on your team that are working to translate that into positive stories.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, John. I have two questions that I will merge, I will bring together. One asks, how can we achieve that technology merges with the indigenous knowledge of 10,000 years ago and capture all that value for current productive systems? And I add, are you currently working with these indigenous peoples in particular currently? Are you working with them?
Great, thank you for that question. It's very important. So for the first part of the question, how do we do this? I think that's a really interesting question, and it does take a lot of thinking, and I have thought about it a lot. So I mentioned a paper at the beginning of my talk around, and this is a word I made up, so there won't be a translation for it. I'm warning the translators. Ethnophytotechnology, that blends the ethno part of this, so the anthropological part of this, that's the indigenous knowledge, with the biotechnology part. So human knowledge is one thing, right? We have a continuum of understanding of how we interrelate with plants, and we make our food and we make our medicines from these plants. And the knowledge that we have now actually is inherited from our indigenous ancestors. So, you know, even people in the globalized economy, the globalized medicine and food systems, we have already tapped into that in some way. We are not separate from it. However, we do have indigenous peoples around the world who do continue to hold advanced forms of knowledge that have not been translated into forms that can be used by the greater world. And there are at least two important things we have to keep in mind with this. The most important thing is protecting those people themselves, right? Because those people, the indigenous peoples of the world, are holding knowledge that once it is gone, it will be gone forever, and we'll never be able to recover it. And that is very precious and important. And the second part of that is that knowledge is not just to be taken, right? It's not to be exploited and taken. Any knowledge that is shared amongst and between us and indigenous people has to be done in a very careful a very careful way that is sure to make sure that we aren't infringing upon the human rights of those people, and that we also are able to create the most benefit for everyone. So there actually are international regulations that regulate how we are to interact with indigenous people in particular, so that we respect the sovereignty of those people, and that we respect the knowledge that they have. These are things like the Nagoya Protocol, provisions on access and benefit sharing, meaning that any technology, meaning just the knowledge itself that comes from indigenous peoples, has to be appropriately compensated and preserved in some way. So how do we do that? I guess the bigger answer is carefully. So that's the first thing. It has to be very carefully and respectfully done. And it has to be in a way that integrates, so that there isn't just a one-way stream where just indigenous people are giving or having taken away from them the knowledge, but it needs to be shared in a way that's mutually beneficial. So in that paper, Ethno-Phytotechnology paper, I outline a few ways that we can take, we can share that indigenous knowledge in ways that will help benefit how we look at plant medicine in particular. So the way that indigenous people continue to use plants as medicine is, for the most part, not understood very well by a globalized science. So if we can understand that better, and then we can use the platforms we have in industrialized society to make a lot more of those medicines or preserve biodiversity, those are ways that might actually feed back and help humans as a whole rather than just one segment of humans. There's a lot more to that, but I don't want to just spend the whole time answering that question. And then, am I working with those populations right now? So as of May of this year, I moved from, I still have an appointment at Harvard University where some of my work is in indigenous knowledge. But as of May, rather, I moved to the Rockefeller Foundation, where I am not directly working with indigenous people myself. Everything that we do, the periodic table of food, which I mentioned in my talk and Julian mentioned briefly at the beginning, the foods that we will choose to be analyzed in the periodic table of food, we have identified about 12 regions around the world, and each of those regions contain indigenous people, and we expect to have accessions in that database that are from indigenous people. So we have partners in the field around the world who are making sure that we also analyze foods that indigenous people consume that maybe we don't see normally in our markets. We don't want this to just be, the standard staple crops. We want it to be the full richness of all the crops of the world, so that we know the benefits of biodiversity and the health effects, for instance, of foods that maybe we're not consuming on the large scale. This could have a huge impact on agriculture and on health and the environment, because indigenous crops, these underutilized crops, may hold very important chemical compounds. They may hold nutrients. They may hold new ways of growing things that will really benefit all of the world at some point. And the only way to know that will be to start to be able to analyze them and compare them to things like wheat and potatoes and rice and the things, and cassava and things like that that are eaten every day around the world already.
Muy interesante, John.
Very interesting, John. This can create the knowledge or new knowledge of products that have been discarded throughout history, and the humankind didn't use it. That can be that the case. Can we change the trend of consumption? Can we get knowledge about new or introduce new food products that have been left aside? Could that be the case?
That's a great point. And that's exactly what we hope will happen with this project. That we focus on about 8 to 10 crops around the world that most of our calories come from, and the Green Revolution, which in part, a major part, was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, and has took place around 50, 60 years ago, and then culminated in allowing the world's population to grow without the massive amounts of starvation that were predicted, which some parts of that are great, right? We perhaps saved billions of lives over time. However, by doing that, it allows the population to grow to such a degree that it may just continue to grow. So this idea that population will continue to grow to 10 billion people could be difficult for the world to handle. And at the same time, those crops that were developed during the Green Revolution and the practices associated with them, including the side effects like contamination of groundwater, the overuse of fertilizers, and other things like this, have been perhaps negative contributions to the world. And by looking at diversity, biodiversity in particular, finding new crops, we could potentially prop up new markets. So we could potentially have new indigenous communities perhaps might have knowledge about how to grow certain new crops that might integrate into globalized food systems. And they also might be crops that are just better for us. They might be healthier. They might have more antioxidants and phytonutrients. But if we don't explore and we don't understand those scientifically, then we won't ever know. So I agree. I think that will be a major benefit of some endeavors like the periodic table of food and others that seek to look at these new crops.
Excelente. Y vamos.
Excellent. We will try to participate in the food dome and in that meeting that you referred to at early September. So you are welcome to join this newsletter that Rockefeller Foundation is inviting us to. I don't want to take more of your time. You talk about controlled environment. Depending on where you are in the world, controlled environment are a reality, are already happening. Do you believe that this will be part of the solution? And shall we be able to capture what history is bringing to us from 10,000 years ago? Do you think that we will be able to bring along different kinds of potatoes in the Inca culture or in the Peruvian culture? They say there are thousands of potato varieties, of small potatoes varieties. Do you think that this will reach our region? Do you think that this will reach the common consumer, will reach the region?
So I think that controlled environments are interesting and developing technologies that have use in two major places, two major research areas. So one side is looking at how we can optimize production. So in that case, you have to have a crop that is already has value that can be increased because of its chemistry or its nutritional value. It had something very high value. You might think about or flavoring compounds. So you might think about mint or basil is one plant I've looked at, because you can, in a controlled environment, you can optimize production. So you can actually have a maximum amount of these types of chemistries. And we've actually seen a paper recently published that looked at wheat. So you can actually grow what a lot of people have said doesn't make sense. So these big crops that take up a lot of space and that are better grown in fields, you actually can do this in controlled environments. So, but in my opinion, I think right now the state of the art is looking at crops that have high value because of their chemistry and maximizing that chemistry. And then the other side of that is you can also test environments, as you were mentioning. So imagine if you want to know where you can now grow those potatoes that are growing in the Andes, are there other places in the world you could perhaps replicate the environment, at least some parts of the climate, in a controlled environment, and before you actually take those potatoes and try to grow them, on the other side of the world, you may be able to grow it in a controlled environment and test many different variations on that climate, and then see which one is the best. So I think there's two sides. One is optimization for something specific, and the other side is testing a range of climates.
Bueno, John,
Wonderful presentation, John. I would stay asking questions, but we are running out of time. Any final thought that we would like to share with us?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This has been really wonderful, and I'm open to any questions in the future. My email address was up at the end, but I also encourage everyone to go to www.foodperiodictable.org if you're interested in the periodic table of food. It's the big project that I'm working on now, and I think it will help to revolutionize the way that we think about food going forward, I hope. But thank you, Julian. Thank you to the whole organization.
muchas gracias nuevamente. Te saludo.
Thank you very much again. We say bye-bye. This is your home from now on, and whatever we can do from Aapresid to help you, we are at your disposal. Thank you for your time, for giving us the privilege to share these minutes with you. So let's take advantage of this presentation. Really, it was a very important. It's a way to change our way of seeing things, and we need to be prepared for the future, for what comes.